This is Reading the Times for Friday, February 28th, 2020. Coronavirus. Just 1 second. Let's make sure we're on. We're on, ready to go. Coronavirus fears drive stocks down for 6th day and into correction. Global markets tumbled for a 6th consecutive day on Thursday, dragging down the S&P 500 more than 10% in just a week, reflecting rising fears over the coronavirus that is spreading quickly around the world. The S&P 500 fell 4.4% on Thursday, the worst single-day slide for the market since August 2011. In Europe, the FTSE 100 in Britain, the CAC 40 in France, and the DAX in Germany were all more than 3% lower on Thursday. Airstrike hit Turkish forces in Syria, raising fears of escalation. At least 22 Turkish soldiers were killed, said Rami Dogan, the Turkish governor of the South province of Hatay, where the Turkish casualties were arriving. New reports citing social media messages and the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a war monitoring group, put the number of Turkish dead as high as 34. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey held an emergency meeting Thursday evening in Ankara. Turkish media reported. The Turkish military convoy traveling to resupply the post on Thursday first came under attack, and then jets bombed the post itself. Abu Yahya, the senior official of the Turkish-backed Syrian fighting force in Idlib province, said in an interview. Scarred and weary, an Afghan force wonders, what is peace? A police officer from a unit of Afghan police manning outposts in Zabul province on Sunday. Over the past 5 years alone, about 50,000 Afghan police officers and soldiers have died fighting. Ultimately, real peace would mean tens of thousands of Taliban fighters either laying down their arms and going home or integrating into a united Afghan security force. U.S. health workers responding to coronavirus lacked training and protective gear, whistleblower said. In the complaint, the whistleblower painted a grim portrait of agency staff members who found themselves on the front lines of a frantic federal effort to confront the coronavirus in the United States without any preparation or training, and whose own health concerns were dismissed by senior administration officials as detrimental to staff morale. They were admonished, the complaint said, and accused of not being team players, and had their mental health and emotional stability questioned after a phone call with health agency leaders to raise their fears about exposure to the virus. The staff members described a whitewashing of the situation, characterizing the response as corrupt and a cover-up. According to the complaint, and telling the whistleblower and senior officials had treated them as a nuisance. And telling the whistleblower that a senior and did not want to hear their worries about health and safety. The president has spent years assaulting our healthcare system and draining resources from key health programs and showing utter disdain for career federal employees who are the backbone of our government, Mr. Neal said in a statement provided to the Times. Coronavirus diagnosis in California highlights testing flaws. A California coronavirus patient had to wait days to be tested because of restrictive federal criteria. Despite doctors' requests, the CDC had restricted testing to patients who either traveled to China recently or who know they had contact with someone infected with the coronavirus. The medical center requested testing from the CDC. Since patient did not fit the existing CDC criteria for COVID-19, a test was not immediately administered. UC Health Davis Health does not control the testing process. Democratic leaders willing to risk party damage to stop Bernie Sanders. Mr. Sanders argued that he should become the nominee at the convention with a plurality of delegates to reflect the will of the voters, and that denying him the nomination would enrage his supporters and split the party for years to come. In a reflection of the establishment's wariness about Mr. Sanders, only nine of the 93 superdelegates interviewed said that Mr. Sanders should become the nominee purely on the basis of arriving at the convention with a plurality, if he was short of a majority. Some are trying to act well before the convention, since Mr. Sanders won Nevada's caucuses on Saturday. 4 donors have approached former Representative Steve Israel of New York to ask if he could suggest someone to run a super PAC aimed at blocking Mr. Sanders. As New Delhi counts the dead, questions swirl about police response. Sporadic violence continued to flare in India's capital on Thursday as more people questioned the police's failure to quell sectarian violence that has claimed at least 35 lives. Police officials were due in court to respond to claims that they had ignored several specific intelligence warnings over the weekend. The armed Hindu mobs have begun forming to confront Muslim protesters on the outskirts of eastern New Delhi. Many Muslim residents accused New Delhi's police force of siding with Hindu mobs and standing aside while they were attacked. UK courts blocks Heathrow Airport expansion on environmental grounds. Britain's Court of Appeal issued a landmark ruling on Thursday that stymied plans to build a 3rd runway at Heathrow Airport in London, declaring that the government illegally neglected its commitments to reduce carbon emissions and protect the planet from dangerously high temperatures. With Mr. Johnson's government already divided on the expansion plan, the ruling made it less likely he would quickly press ahead, analysts said. The Heathrow runway case hung on a decade-old British planning law that requires the government to take into account its climate policy and making infrastructure plans. In Syria and Libya, Trump is torn over 2 wars and 2 strongmen. President Trump has long sought to avoid confronting the leaders of Turkey and Russia, 2 foreign strongmen who are facing off in civil wars in Syria and Libya. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Tuesday blamed Russia for blocking humanitarian aid to Idlib and said President Bashar Assad of Syria had started a brutal new aggression there, cynically backed by Moscow and Tehran. Last week, Mr. Trump again belittled envoys and evidence showing that Moscow had tried to influence the 2016 presidential election in his favor as the Russia nonsense. Minutes later, he also discussed a recent phone call with Erdogan about Idlib and added, "We're working together on seeing what can be done." U.S. maintains pressure on Iran, stalling diplomacy while expecting attacks. Even Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, and an Iran hawk, has recognized that the Trump administration is offering nothing to entice Iran to come to the negotiation table. 2 senior Middle Eastern officials who speak to the Trump administration regularly on Iran said that they do not expect Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, to agree to start new negotiations with the United States soon. As a way around the American sanctions, European officials are creating a barter system to continue trading with Iran and, in turn, keep the 2015 nuclear deal alive, even though Iran has violated the boundaries of the agreement since Mr. Trump's withdrawal from it. Japan shocks parents by moving to close all schools over coronavirus. After weeks of criticism that Japan was bungling its reaction to the spread of the coronavirus, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe took the drastic step on Thursday of asking all of the country's schools to close for about a month. Although school boards in Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island, and Osaka, Japan's 3rd largest city, had already moved to close schools, Mr. Abe's announcement took parents and analysts by surprise. Mr. Harris added that the move was a starting gun for the sort of panic buying and stockpiling that has occurred in places like Hong Kong. Parents took to social media to express anxiety about what the school closing would mean for working families, a challenge that Hong Kong parents had been dealing with for weeks, as classes had been conducted online as they have also been in mainland China. South Korea leader said coronavirus would disappear. It was a costly error. There were 28 cases of the coronavirus in South Korea on February 13th. A spokesman for Mr. Moon, Kang Min-suok, noted no visitor from mainland China tested positive since South Korea tightened its screening of Chinese arrivals on February 4th. South Koreans' anger spiked this week when they learned that some Chinese cities had begun quarantining South Korean visitors upon landing at their airports, while South Korea had not imposed such restrictions on Chinese arrivals. Mr. Harris added that the move was a... Wait, what? Oh my gosh. I'm not sure if that's it. We're going to have to figure that one out. That sounds like a repeat from the last one, but whatever. Moving on. Italy is a safe place. Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte, a rival Lombardy politician who has himself faced intense criticism for the government's handling of the virus, asserted defensively this week that may be safer than others. Experts at the World Health Organization and Italy's health minister said in interviews that it was possible that Lombardy created an inflated perception of the threat by including in case totals people who tested positive for the virus but who had not gotten sick. The Lombardy officials said they preferred to know who had the virus. Germany tries to solve a coronavirus puzzle with endless pieces. The virus has a 14-day incubation period, so they knew that the man who was hospitalized on Monday could have infected many more people before he started receiving care, all of whom were now in a position to pass the virus along Germany's most populous state and beyond. What the authorities were able to discover was worrisome. The man had not traveled to China or to other virus hotspots like Italy, nor was he known to have come in contact with someone confirmed by authorities to have been infected. Then began the work of retracing the man's steps in hopes of figuring out how he had contacted the virus. Pence will control all coronavirus messaging from health officials. The decision to put Pence in charge was made on Wednesday after the president told some people that the vice president didn't have anything else to do, according to people familiar with the president's comments. The president's selection of Mr. Pence and the decision to name Dr. Birx as the coordinator for the response further erodes Mr. Azar's traditional role as the nation's top health official in charge of directing the government's response to a medical crisis. Aides of Mr. Pence are aware that there are political risks for the vice president if the response to the virus falters in the days and weeks ahead. Critics of the vice president quickly pointed to Mr. Pence's record on public health issues when he was governor of Indiana as evidence that he was not the right person to lead the government's response to a health crisis. China's ban on wildlife trade is a big step, but it has loopholes, conservationists say. China this week announced a permanent ban on wildlife trade and consumption that international conservationists greeted as a major step, but one with troublesome loopholes for the trade in wild animals for medicinal uses. The medicine on comprehensively prohibiting the illegal trade of wild animals, eliminating the bad habits of wild animal consumption, and protecting the health and safety of the people. Bans all trading and eating of non-aquatic wild animals. Daniel Challenger, a researcher at the University of Oxford who has studied the pangolin trade, said the new decision made clear that China was going to clamp down on pangolin meat. But he said attempts to breed pangolins for medicinal purposes appear to be exempt. What has Mike Pence done in health? A 2018 study from researchers at Yale School of Public Health estimated that putting in place a robust public health response, including needle exchanges and stepped-up HIV testing in 2013, when Mr. Pence took office, and opioid abuse was quickly growing in the state, would have averted dozens of HIV cases. Through the Health Indiana Plan model of Medicaid expansion, we learned firsthand the immense value of health insurance as a tool for responding to public health crises. said Susan Jo Thomas, executive director of Covering Kids and Families of Indiana, a nonprofit group that advocates for health coverage. In brief remarks on Wednesday evening after Mr. Trump announced his new role, Mr. Pence mentioned only one experience handling a public health crisis, the first domestic case of Middle East respiratory syndrome, a highly infectious and dangerous virus known as MERS in 2014. Oh, Middle East respiratory syndrome, that's MERS. And an Indiana healthcare worker who had recently returned from Saudi Arabia. At a lockdown Spanish resort, many questions, little information. What's going on? Romain Guillot, 20, a guest from France, asked about the lockdown imposed on patrons of the hotel, the H10 Costa de Palace, a four-star resort in the south of Tenerife, the largest of the islands. Teresa Cruz, a regional health official for the Canary Islands, said in a news conference on Thursday that 130 guests would be permitted to leave the resort because they had arrived after the 4 people diagnosed with the virus had been hospitalized. Still on Thursday evening, paper pinned on some doors designated some guests as isolated zones, according to a guest who shared a picture of a door. Most coronavirus cases are mild. That's good and bad news. Cases were considered mild if they did not involve pneumonia, defined as infection of the lungs, or involved only mild pneumonia, the authors wrote in the study, which is among the largest to date of a new coronavirus. For mild cases, the virus is likely self-limiting, Dr. Jin said, meaning the symptoms will go away on their own, as with the flu and the common cold. The number of mild cases creates its own complications for curbing the virus's spread. Those with mild or no symptoms may not know they have contracted the virus or may pass it off as a seasonal cold. Iran vice president is one of 7 officials to contact coronavirus. An Iranian cabinet member just a few seats away from President Hassan Rouhani has fallen ill with coronavirus, making her Iran's 6th official to test positive, including one prominent cleric who has died. Iran now appears to have the highest number of officials infected by the coronavirus, which first surfaced in the holy Iranian city of Qom. There were unconfirmed reports Thursday that Austria's Foreign Minister Alexander Schallenberg was being tested for a coronavirus infection after returning home from Iran and showing symptoms. Trump's rally recipe: just add data, money, entertainment, and grievance. Like most Facebook groups that support Mr. Trump, hers is a cascade of links to conservative websites, Trump White House social media posts, and doctored photos of the president's enemies, including Ms. Pelosi. Many of its members once worked in law enforcement, as did Miss D'Angelo, an Army veteran who's retired from the police force in Paterson, New Jersey. She now collects a pension that she supplements with an auto body business she runs with her husband in Brigantine, New Jersey. At Mr. Trump's rallies and campaign events, his words are fine-tuned to appeal to white, Christian, blue-collar voters. The Obama campaign's former digital director said the Trump campaign has taken traditional digital tactics in a new direction by spreading misinformation and news of the president's latest political skirmish, basically keeping supporters angry enough to vote. How Bloomberg outspent his rivals and Sanders outraised them all. Candidates are ordered by the total amount spent through January. Ms. Warren's campaign said it already raised more than $17 million in February, while Mr. Buttigieg said his campaign already raised $11 million. Mr. Bloomberg's campaign spent an eye-popping $7 million per day in January, or roughly $300,000 per hour, $5,000 per minute, or $82 per second. Bloomberg pledges restraint on executive power, but reserves legal wiggle room. Jack Goldman, a Harvard Law School professor and former senior Justice Department official in George W. Bush's administration, said that while many of Mr. Bloomberg's responses were fairly conventional, his stated inclinations about what he would unilaterally use force abroad seemed narrower than recent precedents of both parties. Mr. Bloomberg said he would consider signing legislation to constrain presidents from dangling pardons in self-protective context, appointing close family members to White House positions, intervening in pending Justice Department law enforcement actions firing a special prosecutor who is investigating potential high-level wrongdoings by executive branch, and accepting non-financial assistance from foreign governments for political gain. Mr. Bloomberg spoke critically of the practice of a president issuing signing statements, deeming parts of bills to be unconstitutionally intrusive into the executive powers, even as they sign them into law. De Blasio's new side hustle, trolling Bloomberg. The mayor's attacks have angered Mr. Bloomberg's allies, who have mostly avoided criticizing Mr. de Blasio, even during his fleeting run for president last year. Few public officials anywhere are as innovative and clever as Bill de Blasio when it comes to repeated efforts at money laundering. Stu Lozer, a spokesman for Mr. Bloomberg, posted on Twitter, referring to Mr. de Blasio's questionable fundraising practices. John Paul Lupo, an advisor to Mr. de Blasio, said the mayor has consistently made the same arguments against Mr. Bloomberg. They saw themselves in Elizabeth Warren. So what do they see now? The fifth grader's question summed up what had been some of the most challenging issues for Ms. Warren in this campaign. How should she talk about gender? What lesson is she trying to offer young girls? And does her current standing say anything about that of women more broadly in 2020? Of course, not all Democratic women are fans of Ms. Warren, a one-time leading candidate who has polled just slightly higher among women than she has among men, and who has not finished above third in the early states, Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada. These are women who see themselves in Ms. Warren and argue that simply by asking whether a woman can be elected, pundits and voters who fancy themselves as such are creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Ms. Warren's approach obviously doesn't resonate for all women, even progressives who want a woman to win the White House. Pelosi, trying to save House majority, fends off angst over Sanders. Our Speaker Nancy Pelosi facing deep alarm among moderate Democrats who worry that Senator Bernie Sanders will win their party's presidential nomination, only to cost them control of the House, has begun distancing her caucus from the race, the White House, in an effort to insulate her rank from the race for the White House, in an effort to insulate her rank and file and preserve the party's majority. Ms. Pelosi, the highest-ranking Democrat and the de facto leader of her party, insisted in public and in private on Thursday that Democrats would be united around their nominee no matter who it was, even as she pointedly refused to embrace Mr. Sanders' agenda, especially Medicaid for All, which lacks the votes to pass the House. While Ms. Pelosi had repeatedly called for Democrats to remain unified, she is also pushing them to run on a three-pronged for the people agenda, creating good-paying jobs, rooting out corruption, and lowering the cost of health care and prescription drugs, delivered them majority in 2018. We have to win in certain particular areas, she told reporters Thursday morning, adding, it is not unusual for a party platform or the candidates for president to have their own agendas that they would put forth, and it's not unusual for the House of Representatives to have an agenda as well. The political junkie runs for president. Pete Buttigieg has tailored much of his campaign message to the idea that he is the best able to speak flyover country, in addition to all those other languages. One could easily envision Mr. Buttigieg as a peripatetic presidential campaign operative or election commentator, or imagine him organizing watch parties in college, where like-minded revelers at Harvard's Institute of Politics could gather to enjoy that week's episode of West Wing, or see him live blogging the Indiana primary for Slate in 2016, and angling to become the chair of the Democratic National Committee. On Tuesday morning in Charleston, South Carolina, before heading into a prep session for that night's debate, Mr. Buttigieg was asked if his life as a political aficionado has prepared him for making strategic decisions on his own presidential campaign. Ringleader of admission scandal said investigators had told him a lie. The significance of Mr. Singer's notes boils down to a question that lawyers for some parents had suggested would be essential to their defense. Did the parents knowingly agree with Mr. Singer to bribe coaches and other athletic officials? Or did Mr. Singer lead them to believe they're making donations to athletic programs that would result in the children getting advantage in their admissions process? The lawyers had argued that if the parents believed they were making donations, then this was not a crime. In the hearing on Thursday, one of Ms. Laughlin's lawyers, William J. Truck, summarized in his own words what bothered Mr. Singer. The government wants me to say that these were bribes. I told the parents that these were donations, not bribes. They want me to lie. They're yelling at me. Later on Thursday, lawyers for another parent who pleaded not guilty, Gamal Abdelazaz, filed a motion asking the court to require the government to turn over audio of the phone call between Mr. Singer and federal agents that Mr. Singer described as loud and abrasive. Additionally, lawyers for the two parents who have pleaded guilty, Elizabeth and Manuel Henriquez, asked to postpone their sentencing, which are scheduled for next week in light of new evidence for Mr. Singer's phone. Teacher who was suspended after she showed photo of her wife reaches $100,000 settlement. The presentation touched off a complaint from a parent that Miss Bailey was promoting the homosexual agenda. Miss Bailey was suspended for 8 months from the public school where she taught for 10 years and had twice been voted the Teacher of the Year. This week, more than 2 years later, the Mansfield Independent School District agreed to pay Miss Bailey $100,000 to settle a federal lawsuit that she had filed accusing the district of discrimination against her because of her sexual orientation. Miss Bailey sued after the district told her in April 2018 that she would not be allowed to return to Charlotte Anderson Elementary School and would instead be reassigned to a high school in the district. The district agreed to settle the case after Judge Sam A. Lindsay of U.S. District Court in Dallas ruled in November that there did not appear to be any legitimate reason for Miss Bailey to have been suspended and transferred to another school. Why a top Trump aide said, "We are desperate for more immigrants." Immigration, while a sensitive topic, has been a key part of workforce growth in the United States. Robert S. Kaplan, the president of Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, said in an interview, economists at Moody's Analytics have estimated that if immigration consistently dropped to $500,000 a year and stayed there, down from previously normal levels of around 1 million, the nation's total gross domestic product will be around 700 billion smaller by 2030. Proponents of restraining immigration, particularly among low-skilled workers, often argue that newcomers can supplant American workers or depress their wages, even if they help the economy as a whole. Near-term labor shortages, like Chester County's, offer a hint of problems that could arise if the workforce expands more slowly and muted immigration. Immigrants could face nearly $1,000 charge to appeal deportation orders. In proposing the new fees, the Executive Office for Immigration Review, an arm of the Justice Department, said asking immigrants to pay a greater share of costs would help make sure the court resources were available and would also assure the U.S. taxpayer does not bear a disproportionate burden in funding the immigration system. Lawyers representing the immigrants said the proposed fees, especially those for asylum applicants, could violate the United States' legal obligation to provide immigrants fleeing dangerous conditions to a full and fair hearing. Another branch of the government, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, has also proposed a sharp increase in fees for immigrants and visa applicants. A Mexican exodus is helping shrink the undocumented population. The pair are among a growing number of Mexicans who are being deported, who have been departing the United States in recent years, part of a reverse migration that has helped push the undocumented population to its lowest level in more than 15 years. Texas, whose governor and legislature has backed efforts by the Trump administration to crack down on illegal immigration, has experienced an increase in its undocumented population, suggesting that the job opportunities and affordable living luring Americans to the state are also wooing undocumented immigrants. About 4 million of the 10.6 million undocumented immigrants who reside in the United States in 2018 arrived after 2010. Oil industry tool to spare polar bears is more miss than hit. Over more than a decade on the north slope of Alaska, the study found oil companies located fewer than half of the known dens of maternal bears and their infant cubs using airborne instruments called forward-looking infrared or FLIR cameras. The study, published in December on the Journal of Wildlife Management, used computer simulations of surveying designs that varied in where and when the seismic trucks rolled to avoid known denning areas or survey them only after bears had emerged, usually in early March. Dr. Wilson said he was aware of the newer study that questions the effectiveness of FLIR surveys, but he said his study also took into account their limited effectiveness. DeVos orders USC to address systemic failures over arrested gynecologist. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos announced Thursday an agreement with the University of Southern California that requires the school to overhaul its process for responding to sexual assaults after the department found systemic failures in its response to abuse allegations against former gynecologist George Tyndall. Carol Folt, the university president, said in a statement that the agreement reflected its commitment to work in partnership with the Education Department's Office for Civil Rights to further a culture and climate where student, faculty, and staff can learn, work, and thrive. And the university has already taken several steps to improve. In September, the department hit Michigan State University with a record fine after finding the school failed to protect students from abuse by former team doctor Lawrence G. Nassar. Catherine Pugh, former Baltimore mayor, sentenced to 3 years in book fraud. The defendant's scheme to cheat the taxpayer of Baltimore was as bold as it was brazen, and today's sentence shows that the punishment for the actions is swift and severe, said Alfred Watson, assistant special agent in charge of the FBI's Baltimore field office, in the apology video, which was shared by the Baltimore Sun and the other news organizations. Ms. Pugh apologized to anyone she had offended or hurt, and for the damage to the city's image as soft music played in the background. If there's one thing I know about Baltimore, is that we are a resilient city. Brandon M. Scott, the president of Baltimore City Council, said in a statement on Thursday. What would a coronavirus outbreak in the U.S. mean for schools? Around the nation, school officials and parents were flummoxed by the sudden warning that if a coronavirus epidemic hit the United States, school buildings could be shut down for long periods of time, leaving children sequestered at home and schools scrambling to provide remote instruction. While school districts may not be ready for widespread remote learning, many of the larger districts have had plans for the possibility of pandemics for years, according to Chris Dorn, a school safety consultant with the nonprofit Safe Havens International. In the San Jose Unified School District in California, Melinda Landau, who managed school nursing, said the district's response to flu season would also help in the case of a coronavirus outbreak. Warren Bloomberg and rivals agree Trump is not ready for coronavirus. Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts called Wednesday for the federal government to redirect money from construction of President Trump's border wall and put it toward the containment of the fast-spreading coronavirus. While Mr. Bloomberg brandished his experience leading New York City through the swine flu outbreak in 2009, former Vice President Joseph R. Biden invoked his time in the Obama administration as it worked to contain the Ebola virus in 2014. When I was president, Mr. Biden said to the coronavirus, I'd insist that China allow our scientists to make it a hard determination of how it started, where it's from, how far along is it, because that's not happening now. Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota questioned Trump's decision to put Vice President Mike Pence in charge of the administration's response to the outbreak, which has disrupted supply chains and prompted a stock sell-off. Admit it, you don't know what will happen next. In the big screaming urgency of a New York Times headline, I all but commanded you not to panic about the novel virus threatening to spread across the globe. Whether we're talking about the election, the economy, or most any other corner of humanity, we in the pundit class would do well more often to strike a note of humility in the face of the expanding unknown. Will Michael Bloomberg and Trump's gargantuan level of spending on digital ads substantially alter how elections work? Or is it possible that we're overhyping the role of ad spending? Will Americans really recoil from socialism, or do many of us not care so much about an outdated label? Will Sanders' revolutionary arm turn out or stay home? Will our election survive malign interference of domestic ineptitude? How will the virus affect the economy and American sense of safety? And will that be good for Trump or terrible for him? No, not Sanders. Not ever. I've just watched populism destroy traditional conservatism in the GOP. I'm here to tell you that Bernie Sanders is not a liberal Democrat. Populists like Sanders speak as if the whole system is irredeemably corrupt. These days, Sanders masquerades as something less revolutionary than he really is. When a pandemic meets a personality cult. So here's the response of the Trump team and its allies to the coronavirus, or at least so far. It's actually good for America. Rush Limbaugh weighed in. It looks like the coronavirus is being weaponized as yet another element to bring down Donald Trump. Now I want to tell you the truth about the coronavirus. The coronavirus is the common cold, folks. Back in 2014, right-wing politicians and media did indeed try to politically weaponize the disease outbreak, the Ebola virus, with Trump himself responsible for more than 100 tweets denouncing the Obama administration's response. Eric Schmidt, I used to run Google. Silicon Valley could lose to China. Unless these trends change, in the 2030s, we'll be competing with a country that has a bigger economy, and more research and development investments, a better research, wider deployment of new technologies, and stronger computing infrastructure. An independent federal commission on AI, which I lead, recently concluded if AI advances elsewhere outpace those of the U.S. companies and U.S. government and give commercial and military advantages to our rivals, the resulting disadvantage for the United States could endanger U.S. national security and global stability. The same could be said for other emerging technologies. What should the U.S. strategy involve? I'm just glad you asked me. The government should begin by setting our national priorities across emerging technologies with a special focus on research areas that could enhance our defense and security. Why a shortened primary season may prove disastrous. In the early 2016, after Hillary Clinton piled up a series of primary wins and appeared to be tying up the nomination, Senator Bernie Sanders went on a streak of winning caucuses, draining Miss Clinton's time and energy and prolonging divisions within the party. Democratic Party leaders approved of these changes for 2020 because they were fearful that a long contest would help Mr. Trump win a second term. Concerns about Mr. Sanders, who numerous party officials fear could jeopardize Democrats further down the ticket, has party members and former officials madly hatching schemes to stop him. A team of rivals for the Democrats. Thomas Friedman may be right. Democratic candidates need to form a unity ticket, a team of rivals. Can we afford to take all the strong leaders out of the Senate? Or is Tom Friedman suggesting that such a ticket would bring some of the members of the dead Republican Party back to life? Thomas Friedman's brilliant idea for the Democratic Party, announcing a ticket that includes prospective cabinet choices, might go one step further. Mike Pence versus the coronavirus. Why should we be worried by President Trump's naming Vice President Mike Pence to coordinate the government's response to the coronavirus? Mike Pence is an established and proven record in the scientific field. As governor of Indiana, when HIV started its rampage, Mike Pence's proposed solution was those seeking assistance change their sexual behavior. Mike Pence has succeeded already because that's exactly what I'm doing now. New Airbnb listing, a 65-foot tall landmark named Lucy the Elephant. Lucy the Elephant, a national landmark built in 1881. And Margate, a seaside city about 5 miles south of Atlanta City, is the latest of 3 hulking pachyderms and ones that once stood along the East Coast. In exchange for bragging rights to the only elephant lodging in the nation, Airbnb outfitted Lucy with Victorian furnishing and made its contribution to the Save Lucy Committee. Breakfast will be delivered and can be eaten at a table positioned on a landing just below Lucy's circular eyes, which glow blue at night in honor of Old Blue Eyes, Frank Sinatra, a native of Hoboken, New Jersey. Legend has it that the lights in Lucy's eyes once served as a signal for rum runners navigating the ocean during Prohibition. I just got to take a picture of Lucy real quick. With a rebel yell, New York revs up its war on idling vehicles. The campaign, Billy Never Idles, Neither Should You, naturally led to a chant-along led by Mr. Idle, following his claim that Billy never idles. No way. Mr. Idle did not address any possible ethical ramifications of informing on a fellow New Yorker, but city laws clearly encourage it. Helen Rosenthal, a city councilwoman, sponsored the legislation that created a mechanism for people to report the idling and profit from it. Mr. Idle, who spent time in Long Island as a child and lived in New York during the 1980s, said he was looking for a way to give back to the city. Coronavirus in New York, growing anxiety as doctors prepare for an epidemic. New York State officials said that they are ready with huge store of supplies hidden in 3 locations around the state, including a soaring temperature-controlled warehouse near Albany. The state is also asking federal officials to allow testing for the virus at basement-level laboratory adjacent to the state capitol and at laboratories in New York City and elsewhere. Doctors at several hospitals in the city describing growing concern about the new illness and whether New York healthcare system was prepared for it. Second child in 3 days is killed by a vehicle in Brooklyn. A boy, 7, was struck and killed by a vehicle Thursday morning in Brooklyn's East New York neighborhood, the police said. At about 8:30 a.m., the vehicle struck the boy and his mother, 39, who were walking on the crosswalk at the intersection of Blake and Pennsylvania Avenues, the police said. On Tuesday, the 10-year-old girl, Patience Albert, was struck around 8:30 a.m. near the intersection of Crescent Street and Workman Avenue in the East New York area, police said. Should robots have a face? The introduction of robots to public setting like the grocery store is fueling new fears that humans are being pushed out of jobs. A spokeswoman for Badger said one of the supermarket's executives remarked that robot reminded him of an employee named Marty, who was tall, thin, reserved, not very emotional. Since then, the robot had been known as Marty. At the many Marty parties, there were sheet cakes decorated with the robot's signature eyes and goodie bags containing robot fashion from juice boxes and applesauce containers. Trump administration faces economic test as coronavirus shakes markets. The global spread from the deadly coronavirus is posing a significant economic test for President Trump, whose 3-year stretch of robust growth could be shaken by supply chain delays, a tourism slowdown, and ruptures in other critical sectors of the American economy. For now, Mr. Trump has publicly played down the potential economic fallout, saying woes at an aerospace giant Boeing and a strike last year at General Motors and the Federal Reserve reluctance to slash interest rates have done more harm to hurt the economy. Mr. Trump's economic advisors have already been working on a package of tax cuts intended to serve as a centerpiece of his 2020 campaign. Unions push FTC to study if Amazon warps the economy. Mr. Carney said the company's minimum wage of $15 an hour has pushed other employers to increase pay. And in keeping with what the political leaders say they want to see from companies, Amazon has plowed $270 billion into the domestic economy since 2010. That sum includes money Amazon has spent on payroll, buildings, equipment, and other business investments. While Amazon workers are not unionized, those at some suppliers and competitors are, and they feel pressure to adapt to Amazon's business. For the Teamsters, Amazon is a major customer of the transportation companies where they work, and the company is building its own delivery network through a series of small contractors and gig economy drivers who aren't unionized. Facebook, Google, and Twitter rebel against Pakistan's censorship rule. Shahzada Zulfikar, the president of the Pakistan Federal Union of Journalists, urged the government to rescind the regulations which were adopted without any warning or public consultation. So many of the rules end up being used by the government to stifle dissent or to curate content in ways that are conducive to the government's preferred narratives. Separately, regulators in Pakistan have proposed requiring online video sites to obtain licenses from the government. Cloud computing is not the energy hog that is forever feared to be. In 2007, the Environmental Protection Agency forecast another doubling of power consumed by data centers from 2005 to 2010, In 2011, at the request of the New York Times, Mr. Cooey made an assessment of how much data center electricity consumption actually did increase between 2005 and 2010. In 2010, the researchers estimated that 79% of data centers computing was done in smaller traditional computer centers, largely owned and run by non-tech companies. Its data centers, on average, generate 7 times more computing power than they did just 5 years ago, using no more electricity, according to Urs Holz, a senior vice president who oversees Google's data center technology. In sudden move, Chicago Tribune's 2 top editors are departing. The Tribune Publishing, the owner of the Chicago Tribune, announced on Thursday that the newspaper's top two editors were departing, just months after it revealed that a hedge fund known for aggressive price cutting at newspapers had secured roughly 1/3 of the company. Bruce Dole, the publisher and editor-in-chief, was replaced by Colin McMahon, effectively immediately. Terry Jimenez, the president and chief executive of Tribune Publishing, said in a statement on Thursday, the Chicago Tribune newsroom had been on edge since late last year, when Tribune Publishing disclosed that Alden Global Capital, a hedge fund based in New York, was the company's biggest shareholder, with a stake of approximately 1/3 of the company. Founder of 8chan faces arrest on cyber libel charge. Frederick Brennan, who founded but later distanced himself from the 8chan message board, has given encouragement and visibility to violent extremists, is facing arrest in Philippines in a cyber libel case brought by the site's current owner. The case stems from Twitter posts Mr. Brennan, who gave up control of 8chan in 2015, directed at Jim Watkins, who took over the site and also lives in the Philippines. Mr. Watkins, whose message board contains unapologetically racist material that has frequently cheered deadly violence, sued Mr. Brennan after tweets that referred to Mr. Watkins as senile and called the site's moderators incompetent. Would a free milkshake get you to ignore your phone while driving? Texting is the most alarming distraction, according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, adding, using a cell phone while driving creates enormous potential for death and injury. In 2017, the most recent year for which NHTSA website lists complete statistics, distracted driving killed 3,166 people. The approach is a free app that uses the cell phone itself to discourage its use while you're driving. According to Mr. Frankel, 6 weeks after the app's introduction in 2018, over 10,000 drivers were using it. Virus disrupts China's shipping, and world ports feel the impact. More tonnage of container ships is idled around the world now than during the global financial crisis, according to Alpha Liner, a shipping data service. Daily charter rates for tankers and bulk freighters have plummeted more than 70% since early January as China buys less oil, iron ore, and coal, said Tim Huxley, the chief executive of Mandarin Shipping, Hong Kong-based freight shipping line. If there's nothing coming on the dock, there's no reason for ships to come, said Simon Heaney, senior manager for container shipping at Drury, a maritime research firm in London. FCC to fine cell phone carriers for sending customers locations. Ajit Pai, the FCC chairman, said in a letter to the House Commerce Committee last month that the agency's investigators had concluded that one or more wireless carriers apparently violated federal law, but it was unclear at the time which penalty the FCC would suggest. The FCC is fining companies depending on the number of days they allowed the data access to continue. Senator Ron Wyden, an Oregon Democrat who had repeatedly pressured the companies and the FCC over data sharing, said in a statement on Thursday that the chairman only investigated after public pressure mounted, adding that the fines were comically inadequate to deter future privacy violations. And that has been Reading the Times for Friday, February 28th, 2020. And my name is Shaz, and that is all we have for you today.